Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their afternoons at dance lessons or shopping at the mall, she could be found in her grandfather's workshop, learning to fix engines or practicing her aim with an old BB gun behind the barn. Her grandfather, Miguel, was a retired military veteran who had served 3 tours overseas. He saw something special in Sarah's steady hands and unwavering focus. The year was 1998, and Sarah was 15 years old when she first walked into Thompson's gun range with her grandfather. The moment they stepped through the door, conversation stopped. Men in camouflage clothing and cowboy boots turned to stare at the teenage girl with braided hair and worn-out sneakers. The range owner, Buck Thompson, was a gruff man in his 60s, who had been running the business for over 20 years. He had seen plenty of fathers bring their sons for shooting lessons, but a girl, that was unusual. "You lost, sweetheart?" Buck asked, his voice carrying a tone that suggested she should be anywhere but there. "The grocery store is down the street." Miguel stepped forward, his weathered face showing the patience of someone who had dealt with prejudice before. "My granddaughter wants to learn to shoot," he said simply. "We heard this was the best place in town." Buck laughed, a sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Girl, shooting ain't like playing with dolls. This is serious business. You could get hurt." He gestured toward the men at the firing line, their rifles creating thunderous echoes. "Maybe you should try something more suitable for a young lady." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she also felt something else rising within her: determination. She had heard these words before, from teachers who doubted her abilities in math class, from coaches who overlooked her for sports teams, from neighbors who thought she was too ambitious for her own good. But this time was different. This time she had her grandfather's support and her own burning desire to prove everyone wrong. "I'm not afraid," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "And I'm not here to play. I want to learn properly." The other customers had gathered around now, creating an audience that made Sarah feel like she was on display. She heard whispered comments, "What's her daddy thinking?" and "Girls these days don't know their place." But Miguel placed a protective hand on her shoulder, giving her the strength to stand her ground. Buck shook his head, clearly frustrated. "Look, kid, I've been doing this for decades. Women just don't have the upper body strength or the mental focus for precision shooting. It's not personal, it's biology. You'd be better off taking up something more appropriate." That word, appropriate, hit Sarah like a slap. Who decided what was appropriate for her? Why should her gender determine her interests or abilities? She thought about all the times she had outshot her male cousins with her grandfather's BB gun, how she could hit a tin can from 50 yards while they missed from 20. She thought about her steady hands that never shook, even under pressure, and her ability to focus for hours on end when something interested her. "Give me a chance," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "One chance. If I can't handle it, I'll leave and never come back." The men around them chuckled, placing bets on how quickly the little girl would run crying from the range. But Miguel saw something in his granddaughter's eyes that he recognized from his military days. The look of someone who would not be defeated easily. Buck finally relented, more out of curiosity than belief. "Fine," he said, grabbing a small .22 caliber rifle from the rack. "But you're paying for the full lesson whether you finish it or not. And when you quit, don't say I didn't warn you." As they walked toward the firing line, Sarah could feel dozens of eyes watching her every move. The weight of their expectations, or rather their lack of expectations, pressed down on her shoulders. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, she used it as fuel. Every doubtful glance, every whispered comment, every condescending smile only made her more determined to succeed. The first time Sarah held a real rifle, she was surprised by its weight and the cold metal against her skin. But as Miguel showed her the proper stance, how to breathe, where to place her feet, everything began to feel natural. The noise of the range faded into background static as she focused on the target 50 yards away. The circular pattern with its concentric rings seemed to call out to her, challenging her to prove herself. Buck demonstrated the proper shooting technique with obvious skepticism, explaining each step as if Sarah couldn't possibly understand the complexities involved. "Most beginners, especially girls, get nervous and jerk the trigger," he said. It takes years to develop the steady hands and mental discipline needed for accuracy. Sarah nodded politely, absorbing every word while internally rolling her eyes at his patronizing tone. When it was finally her turn, she approached the firing line with deliberate calm. She could hear the conversations behind her stop as everyone waited to see the inevitable failure they expected. She raised the rifle, feeling its weight distribute across her shoulder and arms. Her breathing slowed naturally, just as her grandfather had taught her during their practice sessions with the BB gun. The world around her seemed to fade away until there was nothing but her, the rifle, and the target. Her finger found the trigger, and she applied steady pressure just as Miguel had shown her countless times. The shot rang out, sharp and clear. Sarah lowered the rifle and looked downrange, her heart pounding with anticipation. Through the scope, Buck examined her target with obvious disbelief. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Sarah fired 4 more shots, each one deliberate and controlled. When Buck checked the target again, his expression had changed completely. All 5 shots were clustered in the center ring, creating a tight grouping that would have impressed even experienced shooters. The range had gone completely silent. The men who had been placing bets on her failure now stared in amazement. Some looked impressed. Others appeared annoyed that their assumptions had been proven wrong so dramatically. "Well, I'll be damned," Buck said, holding up the target for everyone to see. The tight grouping was undeniable proof of Sarah's natural ability. "That's some of the best shooting I've seen from a first-timer in 20 years. But even as praise began to replace doubt, Sarah could sense the underlying resistance. This was just the beginning. She had proven she could shoot, but she knew the real challenges lay ahead. The shooting world was dominated by men who had spent decades building an exclusive culture. Breaking into that world would require more than just one good day at the Grange. As they left Thompson's gun range that afternoon, Miguel beamed with pride. "You showed them, mija," he said, using the Spanish term of endearment he had called her since childhood. "But this is just the start. If you really want to make a mark in this sport, you'll need to work harder than any of them expect." Sarah looked back at the range, already planning her return. She had tasted success and it was intoxicating. But more than that, she had experienced the satisfaction of proving her doubters wrong. The comments and skepticism that had stung earlier now served as motivation. She would show them all that gender had nothing to do with skill, determination, or the right to pursue one's dreams. That night, Sarah lay in bed planning her future in competitive shooting. She didn't yet know that she would face years of discrimination, that tournament organizers would try to ban her from competitions, or that sponsors would refuse to support her simply because she was female. She didn't know that she would have to fight for every opportunity, every chance to compete, every moment of respect. What she did know was that she had found her calling, and no amount of prejudice would stop her from pursuing it. The girl who wouldn't listen to those who said she couldn't succeed was about to begin a journey that would change her life and challenge an entire sport to confront its outdated assumptions about women's abilities. The foundation had been laid, and Sarah Martinez was ready to build something extraordinary on top of it. 3 years had passed since Sarah's first day at Thompson's gun range, and the 15-year-old girl had transformed into an 18-year-old woman with calloused hands and a reputation that preceded her. Every weekend found her at the range, practicing for hours while other teenagers spent their time at parties or hanging out at the mall. Her dedication was absolute, her focus unwavering, and her improvement remarkable. The local shooting community had grudgingly accepted her presence, though acceptance didn't necessarily mean respect. Sarah consistently outshot men who had been handling firearms since before she was born. Yet she still heard whispered comments about lucky shots and natural talent that wouldn't last. The assumption seemed to be that her success was temporary, a novelty that would fade once she faced real competition. Buck Thompson, the range owner who had initially doubted her abilities, had become one of her most vocal supporters. He watched in amazement as Sarah's scores improved month after month, her groupings growing tighter, her consistency becoming legendary among the regular customers. But even Buck harbored doubts about how far a woman could really go in competitive shooting. "You're good, Sarah, real good," he told her one Saturday afternoon as she cleaned her rifle with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. "But local competitions are one thing. The big leagues? That's a whole different world. Those boys have been shooting competitively since they were kids, with professional coaches and expensive equipment. Sarah looked up from her cleaning, her dark eyes reflecting a determination that had only grown stronger over the years. "Then I guess I'll have to work twice as hard to beat them," she replied simply. Her first real test came at the Texas State Youth Championship, held in Dallas that spring. Sarah had saved money from her part-time job at a local diner to pay for the entry fee and travel expenses. Her grandfather drove her the 4 hours to Dallas in his pickup truck, the back loaded with her equipment and dreams. The registration table was staffed by a middle-aged woman who looked surprised when Sarah approached with her paperwork. "Honey, are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked kindly. "The women's auxiliary has a nice little tournament next month, much more suitable for someone your age." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "I'm here for the youth championship," she said, handing over her registration forms. "I believe I meet all the requirements." The organizer reviewed the paperwork with obvious reluctance. "Well, technically yes, but dear, you should know that no girl has ever placed in the top 10 at this tournament. You might be setting yourself up for disappointment." Behind Sarah, a line of young male competitors had formed, their expensive gear and confident attitudes creating an intimidating atmosphere. She could hear their conversations about past victories, professional coaches, and shooting scholarships to prestigious universities. Some cast curious glances in her direction, clearly wondering what she was doing there. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said firmly, "but I'd like to compete anyway." The competition spanned 3 days, with different shooting disciplines testing various skills. Sarah had prepared for months, but nothing could have prepared her for the psychological pressure of being the only female competitor among 63 young men. Every range officer seemed surprised by her presence. Spectators pointed and whispered. Even the other competitors treated her like a curiosity rather than a legitimate threat. During the practice rounds, Sarah noticed something troubling. Several competitors and even some officials seemed to be watching her more closely than necessary. When she asked questions about rules or procedures, the responses often came with condescending explanations of basic concepts she already understood. It was as if no one could believe she belonged there or knew what she was doing. The first event was precision rifle shooting at 200 yards, Sarah's strongest discipline. She had spent countless hours perfecting her technique, learning to read wind conditions, and developing the mental discipline necessary for consistent accuracy. As she took her position on the firing line, she could feel the weight of skeptical eyes upon her. The range commands began, and Sarah fell into the familiar rhythm she had practiced thousands of times. Her breathing slowed, her world narrowed to the target downrange, and her finger found the trigger with practiced precision. Shot after shot, she felt the satisfying recoil of the rifle, and knew instinctively that each round was finding its mark. When the targets were scored, Sarah's name appeared in 3rd place overall. The silence from the spectators was deafening. She had not only competed successfully, but had outshot 59 of the 62 other competitors, including several who were considered favorites to win the entire championship. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some spectators applauded her achievement, recognizing exceptional skill when they saw it. Others seemed almost angry, as if her success somehow diminished the accomplishments of the male competitors. Sarah heard one father tell his son, "Don't worry about her. Girls just get lucky sometimes." Between events, Sarah overheard a conversation between 2 tournament officials that made her blood boil. "We might need to consider separate divisions next year," one said. "Having a girl competing against the boys isn't really fair." Fair to whom? Sarah wondered silently. She was competing under the same rules, with the same equipment, on the same ranges as everyone else. If anything, she faced additional challenges that the male competitors never had to consider. The second day brought the moving target event, where competitors had to track and hit targets that traveled across the range at various speeds. This was considered one of the most difficult disciplines, requiring split-second timing and excellent hand-eye coordination. Sarah had practiced extensively on a makeshift moving target system that her grandfather had built behind their barn. As she prepared for her turn, Sarah noticed that several competitors had gathered to watch her performance. Some seemed genuinely curious about her technique, while others appeared to be waiting for her to fail. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah had learned to channel nervousness into focus. The targets began their mechanical journey across the range, and Sarah tracked them smoothly with her rifle. Her shots were crisp and confident, each one connecting with its moving target. When the round ended, she had achieved a perfect score, hitting every target in the center ring. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of amazement and uncomfortable silence. "That was incredible," whispered one competitor, a young man from Houston who had been shooting competitively for 8 years. "I've never seen anyone shoot moving targets that well." But not everyone was impressed. Sarah overheard another competitor grumbling, "She probably practices on rabbits or something. It's not the same as real competition shooting." The comment stung because it revealed the underlying assumption that her success must somehow be illegitimate or accidental. No matter how well she performed, there would always be those who attributed her achievements to luck, special circumstances, or anything other than skill and dedication. As the tournament progressed, Sarah's consistency became impossible to ignore. She placed in the top 5 in every event, demonstrating mastery across multiple shooting disciplines. Her overall score put her in second place going into the final day, just 5 points behind the leader, a young man from Austin who had been shooting competitively since age 12 and had won the tournament the previous year. That evening, Sarah and her grandfather ate dinner at a small restaurant near their motel. She was exhausted but exhilarated, riding the high of performing well under pressure. But she was also troubled by some of the reactions she had witnessed. "Abuelo," she said, using the Spanish word for grandfather. "Do you think they'll ever accept me? Really accept me?" Miguel looked at his granddaughter with pride and concern. He had seen the whispered conversations, the skeptical looks, the attempts to minimize her achievements. "Some will, mija, some won't. But that's not why you're here, is it?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm here because I love to shoot, and I'm good at it. But I'm also here to prove that being a woman doesn't make me less capable." "Then focus on that," Miguel advised. "Let your shooting do the talking. Results don't lie, even when people want to ignore them." The final day of competition would determine the overall champion. Sarah knew she needed to shoot almost perfectly to overcome her 5-point deficit. More importantly, she knew that winning would send a message that could not be ignored or dismissed. A female youth champion would force the shooting community to confront their assumptions about women's capabilities. As she prepared her equipment that morning, Sarah felt the weight of expectation from both supporters and detractors. Some wanted her to succeed because they believed in equality and fair competition. Others wanted her to fail because her success challenged their worldview. But Sarah had learned to block out external pressures and focus on the one thing she could control: her own performance. The final event was long-range precision shooting at 300 yards, the most technically demanding discipline in the tournament. Weather conditions were challenging, with shifting winds that required constant adjustments and calculations. Sarah had studied meteorology and ballistics extensively, understanding that successful long-range shooting was as much science as art. As she took her position on the firing line for the last time, Sarah knew that this moment would define not just her own future, but possibly the future of women in competitive shooting. Win or lose, she had already proven that women belonged in this sport. But a victory would make that statement impossible to ignore. The morning of the final competition dawned gray and windy, with conditions that would challenge even the most experienced shooters. Sarah stood at the 300-yard firing line, her rifle steady in her hands as she studied the wind flags fluttering erratically across the range. The 5-point deficit she faced seemed manageable, but she knew that in precision shooting, every point mattered. One bad shot could end her championship hopes. The young man from Austin, David Chen, stood 3 positions down from her. He had been polite but distant throughout the tournament, treating her with the kind of careful respect reserved for unexpected complications. David was the defending champion, the son of a professional shooting coach, and had college scholarships waiting for him. To him, Sarah represented an anomaly that threatened the natural order of his sport. "Shooters, prepare for the first string," the range officer announced. Sarah took her position, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder. The wind was gusting unpredictably, requiring her to make constant adjustments to compensate for its effect on her bullet's trajectory. She had spent countless hours studying wind patterns and bullet physics, knowing that knowledge would be as important as marksmanship skill. The first shot felt perfect as it left the barrel, the rifle's recoil familiar and comforting. Through her spotting scope, Sarah watched the bullet impact just outside the center ring. It was a good shot under the conditions, but not great. David's shot had found the center ring, extending his lead to 7 points. As the competition progressed, Sarah found herself in a familiar psychological battle. Part of her mind wanted to rush, to take risky shots in an attempt to make up ground quickly. But her grandfather's training had taught her patience. Shooting is like life, Miguel had often said. Steady progress beats desperate gambles every time. Shot after shot, Sarah methodically chipped away at David's lead. Her consistency was remarkable under the challenging conditions, with each bullet finding the target close to where she had intended. The spectators had grown quiet, sensing the dramatic tension building as the two competitors traded excellent shots. With 5 shots remaining, Sarah had closed the gap to 3 points. David was beginning to show signs of pressure, his usual confident demeanor replaced by intense concentration. The crowd had swelled as word spread about the close competition and the possibility of the first female youth champion in the tournament's history. Sarah's coach for the weekend was Buck Thompson, who had driven up from their hometown to support her. Between strings, he offered minimal advice, knowing that Sarah's preparation was thorough and her instincts sound. "Trust your training," he whispered as she prepared for the 4th shot. "You've earned this moment." The 4th shot was crucial, and Sarah knew it. The wind had calmed slightly, offering a brief window of more predictable conditions. She waited patiently for the perfect moment, her breathing controlled and her focus absolute. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the shot felt different somehow, perfect in a way that experienced shooters recognize immediately. The bullet struck the exact center of the target, earning Sarah maximum points and reducing her deficit to just 1 point. The crowd's reaction was audible, a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. David's responding shot was excellent, but not quite as precise, leaving the door open for Sarah to take the lead with her final shot. Standing at the firing line with 1 shot remaining, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about all the people who had told her that women couldn't compete with men in shooting sports. She thought about the tournament officials who had suggested she belonged in a separate, lesser division. She thought about every doubter who had attributed her success to luck rather than skill. But mostly, she thought about her grandfather, who had believed in her when no one else would. Miguel stood behind the firing line with tears in his eyes, watching his granddaughter prepare to make history. He had taught her to shoot, but more importantly, he had taught her to believe in herself when the world insisted she should know her place. The final shot required everything Sarah had learned over 3 years of dedicated practice. The wind was shifting again, and she had to calculate the precise adjustments needed to compensate. The mathematics of ballistics flowed through her mind automatically: wind speed, distance, bullet weight, atmospheric pressure. But beyond the technical calculations was something more intuitive: the shooter's instinct that separated good marksmen from great ones. Sarah's finger found the trigger, and she applied steady pressure while maintaining perfect sight alignment. The rifle fired, and she knew immediately that the shot was perfect. Through her spotting scope, she watched the bullet impact in the exact center of the target, the best shot she had ever fired under competition conditions. The range fell silent as officials scored the targets. Sarah had fired a perfect shot, while David's final shot, though excellent, was slightly off-center due to the pressure. When the final scores were announced, Sarah Martinez had become the first female youth shooting champion in Texas state history, winning by a single point. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Many spectators erupted in applause, recognizing the historic achievement they had witnessed. Sarah's fellow competitors were mostly gracious in defeat, understanding that they had been beaten by superior shooting rather than luck or circumstance. David Chen approached her immediately after the scores were announced, extending his hand with genuine respect. "That was incredible shooting," he said, his earlier reserve replaced by admiration. "I've never seen anyone handle pressure like that. You earned this victory completely." But not everyone was pleased with the outcome. Sarah overheard several angry conversations among parents and officials who seemed personally offended by her success. Some questioned whether the competition had been fair, suggesting that perhaps the scoring had been influenced by political correctness rather than actual performance. "This changes everything," one official muttered to another. "We'll have girls thinking they can compete at every level now. It's going to complicate things significantly." The comment revealed the real fear that Sarah's victory had created. It wasn't just about one tournament or one exceptional individual. Her success threatened to open doors that many in the shooting community preferred to keep closed. If one woman could win a major youth championship, others might follow. The sport's masculine culture was being challenged in a fundamental way. During the awards ceremony, Sarah stood on the top step of the podium with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She had achieved something remarkable, but she also understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The shooting world had been forced to acknowledge her abilities, but acceptance would be a longer and more difficult process. The trophy felt heavy in her hands, representing not just her individual achievement, but the dreams of countless other women who had been told they didn't belong in competitive shooting. As photographers captured the historic moment, Sarah thought about the young girls who might see these images and decide to pick up a rifle despite the obstacles they would face. In her victory speech, Sarah was gracious but firm. "I want to thank everyone who believed in me and supported my journey," she said, looking directly at her grandfather. "But I also want to say that this victory isn't just about me. It's about proving that talent and dedication matter more than gender. I hope that someday a woman winning a shooting competition won't be considered unusual or controversial." The audience's reaction was mixed, with some enthusiastic applause and others who remained notably silent. Sarah had chosen her words carefully, making a statement about equality without being confrontational. She understood that winning hearts and minds would be as important as winning competitions. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a reporter from a shooting magazine who wanted to interview the new champion. The questions revealed the bias she would continue to face throughout her career. Instead of asking about her training methods or competitive goals, the reporter focused on how she balanced shooting with feminine interests and whether she planned to continue competing after getting married and having children. "I plan to compete as long as I love the sport and continue to improve," Sarah answered diplomatically, just like any male competitor would. The drive home to Texas was quiet, with both Sarah and Miguel processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The victory was sweet, but they both understood that it had also painted a target on Sarah's back. She would face increased scrutiny, higher expectations, and continued resistance from those who viewed her success as a threat to tradition. "What happens now, abuelo?" Sarah asked as the Texas landscape rolled past their truck windows. Miguel smiled, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel. "Now the real work begins, mija. You've proven you can compete with anyone. The question is whether you're ready to fight for the right to keep competing." Sarah stared out at the horizon, her mind already focused on the challenges ahead. She had won her first major championship, but she sensed that much larger battles awaited. The shooting community had been forced to acknowledge her abilities, but changing deeply ingrained attitudes about women in sports would require sustained effort and continued excellence. The girl who had walked into Thompson's gun range 3 years earlier had become a champion. But more importantly, she had become a symbol of possibility for women who dared to challenge the boundaries that society had placed around them. The trophy beside her in the truck was just the beginning of a legacy that would inspire generations of female shooters to come. 2 years had passed since Sarah's historic youth championship victory, and the shooting world had not embraced change as readily as she had hoped. Now 20 years old and competing in adult divisions, Sarah faced new challenges that went beyond proving her marksmanship abilities. The resistance to her presence had evolved from skepticism to active hostility in some quarters, with tournament organizers and fellow competitors finding creative ways to make her feel unwelcome. The National Precision Shooting Championship in Colorado represented the pinnacle of competitive shooting in America. Winners of this tournament went on to represent the United States in international competitions and Olympic trials. For Sarah, it represented the ultimate validation of her abilities and her right to compete at the highest levels of her sport. The registration process alone had been a battle. When Sarah submitted her entry forms, they were initially rejected due to a supposed clerical error. When she resubmitted them with identical information, they were rejected again for failing to meet an obscure eligibility requirement that had never been enforced before. Only after Buck Thompson, now serving as her informal coach, made several angry phone calls was her entry finally accepted. "They're trying to keep you out without saying they're trying to keep you out," Buck observed as they drove toward Colorado. His pickup truck was loaded with Sarah's equipment and the confidence that came from years of watching her overcome obstacles. But they can't argue with scores on a target. The venue was impressive, a sprawling complex with multiple ranges designed for different shooting disciplines. Sarah had competed in many facilities over the past 2 years, but nothing matched the scale and prestige of the national championship. As they walked toward the registration building, She noticed the quality of equipment that her competitors brought. Custom rifles worth more than most people's cars, precision scopes that cost thousands of dollars, and support teams that included coaches, spotters, and equipment managers. Sarah's equipment was excellent but modest by comparison. She had saved every dollar from her job at the diner and her grandfather's modest pension to afford the best gear she could manage. Her rifle was accurate and reliable, her scope was precise, and her ammunition was carefully selected for consistency. But she knew she would be competing against people with virtually unlimited resources and full-time support staff. The competitor meeting revealed the scale of the challenge she faced. Of the 120 participants, Sarah was one of only 3 women. The other 2 were competing in separate women's divisions with reduced course requirements and shorter distances. Sarah had specifically requested to compete in the open division against the men, knowing that anything less would undermine the statement she was trying to make. "Miss Martinez," the tournament director addressed her during the meeting, "I want to make sure you understand that the open division is extremely challenging. The women's division offers excellent competition at a more appropriate level." Sarah's response was polite but firm. "I appreciate your concern, but I believe I can handle the challenge. I've been competing against men for over 4 years now." The director's smile was patronizing. "Well, we certainly admire your confidence. Just remember that there's no shame in switching divisions if you find the competition overwhelming." Around the room, Sarah sensed the mixture of attitudes she had come to expect. Some competitors seemed genuinely curious about her abilities, having heard about her youth championship and subsequent victories at state-level competitions. Others appeared annoyed by what they viewed as a publicity stunt or political statement. A few seemed actively hostile, viewing her presence as an intrusion into their exclusive world. During the practice rounds, Sarah became aware of an uncomfortable level of scrutiny. Range officers seemed to monitor her more closely than other competitors, checking her equipment multiple times and questioning procedures she had followed correctly hundreds of times before. Other competitors gathered to watch her shoot, ostensibly out of curiosity but creating an atmosphere of pressure that felt deliberately intimidating. "Ignore them," Buck advised during a break between practice sessions. "They're trying to get in your head. Focus on your shooting and let everything else fade into the background." But ignoring the distractions was easier said than done. Sarah overheard conversations that were clearly intended for her to hear, comments about political correctness and special treatment that suggested her presence was somehow unfair to the male competitors. The irony was lost on them that she was actually competing under more difficult circumstances than anyone else in the tournament. The first day of competition included several qualifying rounds that would determine seeding for the elimination rounds to follow. Sarah's strategy was to shoot conservatively and consistently, avoiding the risky shots that could either elevate her score dramatically or eliminate her from contention entirely. She had learned over 2 years of competition that steady performance was more valuable than occasional brilliance. Her first-round score placed her 7th overall out of 120 competitors, a result that sent shockwaves through the shooting community. She had not just qualified for the elimination rounds, she had earned a high seed that would allow her to avoid the strongest competitors until the later rounds. The performance was impossible to dismiss as luck or favorable conditions. "That's some serious shooting," commented Jake Morrison, a 3-time national champion who had been competing professionally for over a decade. He approached Sarah after the scores were posted, his expression reflecting genuine respect. "I've been watching you shoot, and your consistency is remarkable. Where did you learn to read wind conditions like that?" Sarah appreciated the professional acknowledgement from someone of Morrison's caliber. "My grandfather taught me to observe everything about the environment when I'm shooting," she replied. "Wind, light, humidity, even the way other competitors are performing. It's all connected." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's advanced thinking for someone your age. Most shooters take years to develop that kind of environmental awareness, but not everyone was impressed by Sarah's performance." During the dinner break, she overheard a group of competitors discussing her results with obvious frustration. "There's something wrong here," one said angrily. "Nobody shoots that well without some kind of advantage. Maybe we should check her equipment more thoroughly." The suggestion that she might be cheating because her performance was too good to believe revealed the depth of resistance she faced. Rather than accepting that she might simply be an exceptional shooter, Some competitors preferred to believe that her success must be illegitimate somehow. The second day brought the elimination rounds, where the field would be reduced from 64 qualifiers to 16 competitors who would advance to the final day. Sarah was paired against a veteran shooter from Montana who had been competing professionally for 15 years and had placed in the top 10 at nationals multiple times. The elimination format was particularly challenging, requiring shooters to perform under direct pressure with no room for error. A single bad shot could end a competitor's tournament immediately. Sarah's opponent was clearly confident, having defeated younger and less experienced shooters many times before. "Nothing personal, young lady," he said as they prepared to take the line. "But this is where experience really counts. The pressure gets to newcomers eventually." Sarah nodded politely but felt her competitive fire ignite. She had faced condescending attitudes for years now, and they never failed to motivate her to perform at her absolute best. As they began the elimination round, she channeled that energy into intense focus on her shooting fundamentals. The match was close throughout, with both shooters performing at an extremely high level. Sarah's opponent was clearly surprised by her composure under pressure, expecting her to crack under the strain of elimination competition. But Sarah had been performing under pressure since her first day at Thompson's gun range, when skeptical men had gathered to watch her fail. With 3 shots remaining, Sarah held a narrow 1-point lead. The wind conditions had become increasingly challenging, and she watched her opponent struggle slightly with the adjustments needed for his final shots. When her turn came, Sarah remembered her grandfather's advice about trusting her instincts and her training. Her final 3 shots were near perfect, maintaining her lead and advancing her to the round of 16. As they shook hands after the match, her opponent's attitude had changed completely. "That was exceptional shooting," he said with genuine admiration. "I underestimated you, and that was my mistake. You've earned everything you've accomplished." The acknowledgement meant more to Sarah than any trophy could have. Respect from fellow competitors, earned through performance rather than granted through politics, was what she had been seeking all along. As she prepared for the next day's competition, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from that first day at the shooting range. She was no longer the curious teenager trying to prove she belonged. She had become a legitimate contender for a national championship, someone whose presence changed the dynamics of every competition she entered. But she also understood that the real barriers were still ahead of her. Making the round of 16 was an achievement, but winning a national championship would send a message that could not be ignored or rationalized away. It would force the shooting world to confront the reality that women could not just participate in their sport, but could excel at the very highest levels. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah had learned to transform pressure into focus. Tomorrow would bring the final elimination rounds and, if she continued to perform, a chance to compete for the national championship. The girl who had once been told that women couldn't shoot was now just 3 rounds away from proving that women could be the best shooters in the country. The final day of the National Precision Shooting Championship dawned clear and calm, with perfect conditions that would eliminate weather as a factor in determining the winner. Sarah had barely slept, her mind cycling through the shooting sequences she had practiced thousands of times. She was one of only 4 competitors remaining, having survived 3 grueling elimination rounds that had tested every aspect of her shooting skills. Her semi-final opponent was Jake Morrison, the 3-time national champion who had shown her respect throughout the tournament. Morrison was widely considered the best precision shooter in the country, with techniques so refined that other competitors studied videos of his performances to improve their own skills. Facing him in a head-to-head elimination match represented both an honor and an enormous challenge. "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be shooting against a woman for a spot in the national championship final," Morrison said as they prepared for their match. His tone carried no condescension, only professional acknowledgement of the historic nature of their competition. "But you've earned this chance completely. May the best shooter win." The semi-final match was scheduled for 20 shots at 600 yards, the longest distance of the tournament, and one that demanded absolute precision in both shooting technique and environmental reading. Sarah had spent the previous evening studying wind patterns and light conditions, preparing herself mentally for the most important shots of her career. As they took their positions on the firing line, Sarah was acutely aware of the crowd that had gathered to watch. Word had spread throughout the shooting community about the possibility of the first woman reaching a national championship final. Television cameras were present, ensuring that whatever happened would be seen by a much larger audience than usually followed precision shooting competitions. The match began with both shooters performing at an exceptional level. Morrison's experience showed in his methodical approach and calm demeanor, while Sarah's youth was evident in her aggressive shot selection and willingness to take calculated risks. Through the first 10 shots, they were separated by less than 2 points, with the lead changing hands multiple times. "She's not intimidated by his reputation at all," commented the television analyst, a former national champion himself. "Her shot selection is sophisticated, and her execution is flawless. Morrison is getting the match of his life." During the midpoint break, Sarah's grandfather approached her with quiet words of encouragement. Miguel had made the long drive from Texas to watch his granddaughter compete for a national championship, and his presence provided the emotional anchor she needed to stay focused. "Remember why you started shooting, mija," he said softly. "Not to prove anything to anyone else, but because you loved the challenge and the precision it required. Trust that love now." The second half of the match proved even more intense than the first. Morrison, recognizing that he was in a genuine battle, elevated his performance to the exceptional level that had made him a champion. But Sarah matched him shot for shot, her consistency under pressure becoming the defining characteristic of her shooting style. With 5 shots remaining, Sarah held a narrow 1-point lead. The pressure was enormous, with every shot carrying the weight of either advancing to her first national championship final or ending her tournament in heartbreaking defeat. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Sarah found herself entering the state of focused calm that had characterized her best performances throughout her career. Her final 5 shots were nearly perfect, maintaining her lead and sending her to the championship final. As the scores were announced, Morrison approached her immediately with congratulations that reflected genuine professional respect. "That was the best shooting I've ever seen under that kind of pressure," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "You didn't just beat me today, you outshot me completely. Good luck in the final." The championship final would pit Sarah against David Chen, the same competitor she had defeated for her first major victory at the Youth Championship 4 years earlier. David had developed into one of the country's premier shooters, winning multiple national titles in different age divisions and representing the United States in international competition. "It's fitting that we meet again," David said during the pre-match interviews. "Sarah has been pushing all of us to shoot better just by being here. She's forced the entire sport to raise its level of performance." The final match format was extended, requiring 30 shots at varying distances, from 300 to 1,000 yards. It would test every aspect of precision shooting, from close-range accuracy to long-range ballistics calculations. The winner would not only claim the national championship, but would also set a new tournament record if their score exceeded the existing mark. As Sarah prepared for the most important competition of her life, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the skeptical faces at Thompson's gun range to the respectful competitors she now faced at the highest levels of the sport, she had fundamentally changed perceptions about women's capabilities in precision shooting. But more than changing perceptions, she had changed herself. The uncertain teenager who had asked for one chance had become a confident woman who earned her opportunities through superior performance. The pressure that had once intimidated her now served as fuel for exceptional shooting. The championship final began with Sarah and David shooting alternate strings, their scores displayed on electronic boards that allowed the crowd to follow every shot. The early rounds favored David's experience with varying distances, but Sarah's exceptional wind-reading skills kept her competitive as conditions became more challenging. By the halfway point of the match, they were tied exactly, with both shooters performing at a level that exceeded their previous personal bests. The crowd had grown throughout the day, and the atmosphere had become electric with anticipation. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something special, regardless of who ultimately won. "This is the highest level of precision shooting I've ever seen," observed the television commentator. "Both competitors are shooting scores that would set tournament records. The pressure seems to be bringing out the absolute best in both of them." The decisive moment came during the long-range portion of the match, where competitors shot at targets 1,000 yards away. At that distance, even slight errors in technique or environmental reading would result in shots missing the target entirely. Sarah had always excelled at long-range shooting, finding the mathematical precision required to make those calculations particularly appealing. Her first shot at 1,000 yards was perfect, striking the center of the target with authority that drew gasps from the crowd. David's responding shot was excellent but slightly off-center, giving Sarah a lead that she would need to protect through the final 5 shots of the match. The pressure of those final shots was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Every squeeze of the trigger carried the weight of history, the culmination of years of preparation and struggle. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she found herself shooting with a clarity and precision that seemed to transcend her previous abilities. Her final shot was the best of her career, a perfect strike that not only secured the national championship, but also established a new tournament record that exceeded the previous mark by an unprecedented margin. As the final scores were announced, the crowd erupted in sustained applause that recognized both her individual achievement and its broader significance for the sport. Sarah Martinez had become the first woman to win the National Precision Shooting Championship, setting a record that demonstrated women could not just compete at the highest levels of the sport, but could redefine what those levels were. The girl who had been told that women couldn't shoot had just proven that women could be the best shooters in the world. During the victory ceremony, Sarah stood on the podium holding a trophy that represented far more than individual achievement. It symbolized the breaking down of barriers that had excluded women from full participation in competitive shooting for generations. As photographers captured the historic moment, Sarah thought about the young girls who might see these images and decide that they too could pursue their dreams regardless of what others said was possible. "This victory isn't just about me," Sarah said during her acceptance speech, her voice carrying across a crowd that hung on every word. "It's about proving that talent and dedication are what matter in sports, not gender. I hope that someday, women winning shooting competitions will be so common that it won't be considered newsworthy." The response was thunderous applause from a shooting community that had been transformed by witnessing exceptional performance. The skeptics who had once questioned women's capabilities had been answered definitively by scores on targets that could not be argued with or dismissed. As Sarah left the Grange that day, her grandfather walking proudly beside her, she carried more than just a trophy and a new record. She carried the satisfaction of proving that persistence and skill could overcome prejudice, and the knowledge that she had opened doors for generations of women who would follow in her footsteps. The girl who wouldn't listen to those who said she couldn't succeed had become the woman who proved that anything was possible, with enough determination and the courage to challenge those who tried to define what she could achieve. The record would eventually be broken by other exceptional shooters, but the barrier she had shattered would remain open forever, allowing countless other women to pursue their own dreams of excellence in competitive shooting.